Alright, tell me class, what do you get when you have a lion, a dragon, and a goat who share a single hunger? Well, to answer that, go ahead and open your tomes because today we study a creature not born of nature, but of the abyss, the Chimera. As uncommon as these monstrosities are, I'd wager a bet that you have at least heard of them. They're somewhat common in the tales we tell each other, if for no other reason than their fascinating form. But when it comes down to it, they're so much more than that. So first of all, in your travels you may come across any number of chimera types, but for this entry I'll be covering the most common type that we see. However, towards the end I'll briefly look at a few of the other forms one might find. The most common type begins with the hindquarters of a goat. Then you have the forequarters of a lion, and lastly, the leathery wings of a dragon. And each of these body parts is governed by the head of the animal that it belongs to. For example, if one were to shear the dragon head from the beast, afterwards it'll be very unlikely to be able to fly. Now, this does not apply to the internal organs, which might seem obvious, but we should never make assumptions when learning about powerful foes. Also, I imagine that would make it pretty difficult to exist as a chimera. One other thing to mention, while it's more common to have the head of a red dragon, that doesn't mean that you won't find variations. I've never seen them in person, but I've heard tell of chimeras with the head of a black dragon, for example, a mighty foe indeed. On average, chimeras are about 5 feet tall with a length of approximately 10 feet, and weighing in at about 4,000 pounds. And honestly, the very first time I saw a chimera, if I wasn't so concerned with my well-being, I'd have remarked that they were actually shorter than I had expected. And as far as communication goes, they can comprehend any of the languages its individual heads would normally understand. This primarily comes down to the dragon head, as the lion and the goat cannot understand things such as common or draconic. And though they can understand the languages, I don't believe they can speak either of them, though there are some conflicting reports on this. Moving forward, surprisingly, chimeras are omnivores. As I understand it, this is primarily because one of the heads is commonly that of a goat, which of course is an herbivore. The standard form does broadly prefer meat, but will resort to eating plants if there is no other option. From what I understand, if you were to somehow stumble across a chimera consisting of 3 herbivore heads, that chimera would be an herbivore, though I've never heard of any reports of such a beast. And while doing my research, one thing I learned is that chimera lifespan is completely unknown. That's not to say they can't die due to physical harm or disease, but we've never actually witnessed a chimera pass from old age. In fact, I've heard stories of them living for hundreds or even thousands of years. This could have something to do with their ability to regenerate. For example, if one head is damaged beyond repair, the chimera will typically try to sever that head, then retreat back into its lair, where the head will eventually grow back. Though the timescale for this is pretty unclear. Absolutely fascinating creatures though, wouldn't you say? But that covers the basics, so let's keep going. Let's see what the lore says about the origins of such a creature. This will be a very short section, mainly because there just isn't very much lore regarding the origins of these beasts. Whether that be because it's unclear to the sages or even concealed from them is simply unknown. But the story is that many years ago, some foolish mages managed to summon the Demon Prince Demogorgon onto the material plane. Why anyone would attempt such a thing, I can't say, because that seems like a remarkably poor decision. However, after being summoned to our plane, it said that Demogorgon looked around the land and was unimpressed by what he saw. And with him being a creature from the chaotic abyss, he would then combine several of the animals he saw at first glance into one being, which I suppose is in character for a fiend like Demogorgon. but either way, that's essentially where the tale goes cold. As to what happened afterwards, I cannot say, though I can't imagine it ended well for the humans responsible. For this section, we'll cover a few of the behaviors commonly found in chimeras. So pay close attention because this section very well could save your life. First of all, I'm hoping none of you ever have to contend with such a beast. The chimera, since it is likely born from the actions of Demogorgon, exhibits the telltale demonic cruelty of the denizens of the abyss, acting as a grim reminder of what happens when a demon prince finds their way onto our plane. Or should I say finds themselves summoned here. Chimeras are not exactly known for their intellect, though it does seem to be influenced by whichever head is less intelligent, which is usually the head of the goat. However, it can go in the opposite direction. If all three heads are above average intellect, you could be in for quite a rough time. And despite being generally unintelligent, they do have surprisingly acute memories. So if you ever try to cheat or fool a chimera, chances are it's gonna remember, which can be fairly concerning because they're also quite adept at seeking revenge. Moving forward, the chimera combines the absolute worst aspects of its three parts. The goat's head grants it a vicious, stubborn streak, making it willing to fight to the death. The lion's head compels it to act in a territorial manner and to hunt and kill powerful foes within its domain. And the dragon's head drives it to raid, plunder, and generally accumulate a hoard of wealth. Chimeras are also very adaptable creatures overall and are able to thrive in most climates. Now, they do prefer hilly regions with temperate climates, but there are tales of the more solitary ones existing in arid tundras and deserts. Moreover, the territory they hold domain over can be up to 10 miles in diameter. And due to its draconic nature, they'll mostly make their lairs within caves decorated with the bones and belongings of their prey. So if you're seeking shelter within a cave and you find bones strewn all around, perhaps it's time to find a different cave and just hope they didn't notice you, because generally they only really go hunting if the need arises. Otherwise they prefer to just rest in their lairs, and most of the time they'll sate their hunger on the wild game nearby. Now, don't get me wrong, don't go underestimating them. Despite preferring to rest, they certainly don't lack energy when combat is initiated. After all, they view unique and powerful creatures as rivals to be defeated, and if they're mostly hunting wild game, you yourself will certainly stand out as unique at the very least. While hunting, they tend to look for ways to amuse themselves. And as a beast harboring such cruelty, this will manifest as the chimera toying with its prey to increase their suffering. In fact, I've read several stories where the chimera will strike, then simply leave the prey wounded and terrified, only to come back later to finish it off. However, that's not to say they're particularly cunning. As a matter of fact, due to their draconic ego, chimeras are susceptible to flattery and gifts. There are numerous instances of them being lured into a wizard's service simply by keeping it well fed and its treasure hoard stocked. So perhaps if you aren't looking for a fight, an offering of gold or a bounty of food could save your life. But say that doesn't work. What can one expect from a chimera should a battle break out? Combat with a chimera isn't always cut and dry. After all, its capabilities depend heavily on the heads it possesses. But if we're just broadly assessing their capabilities, let's say you initiate combat with the standard form. First off, mobility. For being quite heavy, they certainly aren't slow, but neither are they particularly fast. You can likely expect them to use their wings to keep themselves out of reach of your melee warriors, so perhaps keep some ranged weapons at your disposal. But what about stealth, you might ask? That can be a good approach, but remember, they are quite perceptive and also have the ability to see in the dark. So I'd say only attempt that if you're very sure of your abilities. But once combat starts, you can expect any form of attack that one of the types of constituent animals might generally have. That is to say, the goat head will likely try to gore you with its horns. The lion's head will use its fangs as well as its razor-sharp claws. And last but certainly not least, the dragon head will have its breath attack. I will mention, however, that the breath attack isn't quite comparable to a fully fledged breath attack. Chimeras are, after all, a good bit smaller, so they don't have the lungs to summon the attacks you would typically see coming from a standard dragon. But again, I would not underestimate it. Also, one other thing, remember to keep an eye on which type of dragon head the Chimera has. You don't want to plan for the breath of a red dragon only to realize it has the head of a black dragon. That's not the kind of surprise you typically want in the heat of battle. But I think that covers it when it comes to battle tactics. What else do we have here? I did say I'd briefly go over a few of the other less common forms, so what other types of chimeras can you find? These aren't in any particular order, so first up we have the mantimera. The mantimera is a result of crossbreeding between a manticore and a chimera. So for this guy you have the usual head of a goat and dragon, but then you have the head of some type of bestial humanoid. They're quite rare, perhaps because due to their unique breeding, every mantimera is actually sterile and unable to breed. But up next we have something called the gorgamera. For this one you have the head of a lion, the head of a dragon, but then you have the head of a gorgon. They're actually uniquely dangerous because they have the ability to use their draconic breath, as well as the ability to petrify their prey due to the gorgon's head. Also, as a side note, the head of the gorgon can even see into the astral plane. And last but not least, we have something called the thessalmera. Probably equally as deadly as the gorgamera, the thessalmera has the head of a lion as well as that of a dragon. But then, surrounding that lion's head, has 6 to 8 hydra heads. And as one might expect, the first two retain their abilities. But then the hydra heads all act independently in combat, able to inject poison into its prey with every bite. Alright, let's wrap it up. Fascinating creatures to say the least, and powerful foes should you ever cross one's path. Hopefully this entry has gone a long way to prepare you for what might come ahead. So remember, before you bed down in that cave in the mountains, assess your surroundings, because that cave may already belong to something else. Okay guys, thanks for checking out this entry. I love doing these things more and more with each one that I do. I've honestly learned so much doing the research, but anyways, don't forget to like and subscribe, you know the drill. I'll see you guys for the next one, so be safe, take care, and happy trails.